So just one or two other things about our life together. One is we're having our trip meeting for our youth and young adults who will be traveling to France and Italy next summer, to Taizé and to Rome. So that'll be after the second service, if anyone has youth or young adults that they want to send to that. Also, we got all the feedback from the worship focus groups. And so the first Sunday in October, after Cursillo is done, then we'll start making some implementations, some recalibrations. Nothing big. You're not going to come in and the church is turned around and you're like, what has he done? What did he do? Nothing big, but little things to make things a little smoother, a little less confusing, a little more straightforward, and the like. Also, final thing, in October we're doing 3 weeks on the Large Catechism of Martin Luther, but we need to get large catechisms, so if you want one, please let Susan know so we can order them. So the small catechism, which you probably studied when you were in confirmation, was for families, for the instruction of children. It was supposed to help parents instruct their children at home. And the large catechism was meant for adults. So we need something a little meatier for the adults, so let's give it the large catechism. So I appreciate we have some fans, because I know it's a little steamy in here. I know, yes, oh, yes. Oh, the pastor's really doing so well today. Yes. I hope you feel that way, yeah, but I know it's a little steamy. I won't speak too long then to add to the steam, the hot air, but I will say these comments. Like one of the reasons you send us, the pastors, to graduate school is you want us to be well educated so that we can give you the broader context of, what this means and what that means. And well, did you know in ancient Rome they did this? Oh, I didn't know that. Now it makes more sense. And one of the things is the Bible has so many livestock agrarian examples, but the reality is I've read the articles, I've seen the videos, I've talked to the people, I've watched sheep in northern Arizona. I don't know anything about sheep. I still don't know anything about sheep. Like even after all my learning, all my studying, we come up and go, well, let me teach you about the ancient farming techniques of the Israelites. The sheep remain a little bit impenetrable, and they remain irrational, and they do things that you don't understand. That's the whole point. And so my purpose here isn't to get up and say, well, let me give you all the nuances of sheep herding, but to say the world of the gospel is very different than our world. Because Jesus stands up to a group of people and says, who of you, if you had 100 sheep, wouldn't go and do this thing? And the reason he says that is he assumes that everyone in that room would go and look for the sheep, because you only have 100 sheep, because it's hard to replace sheep, because you can't just go and buy new sheep. And we live in a very different world than the world of the gospel, I think. In our world, you can buy new sheep. We live in a consumer-driven, disposable economy where if you lose something, you just order a new one. It's not even worth fixing. Just order a new one. Don't fix it. Don't save it. Just throw it away. Sometimes we even just throw away our stuff just to feel better. We go, oh, I have so much stuff. Thank God I got rid of some of that stuff. It's finally out of the house. Sometimes, and not anyone here, sometimes you feel bad about giving away your stuff because you don't want it. So you call the church and go, certainly you can use it. Yeah, we go. Now, I won't tell you, when I hear someone say, certainly you can use it, but I don't need it, I just want to say, we'll go ahead and throw that away for you. No, sometimes we do. There are books we add to the library. There are material that we can actually give to some of our partners. But, for example, let me just give you a little pro tip. No used medical equipment, please. We don't need any used medical equipment. But that's our way of interacting with the world is, if it's lost, write it off or replace it. Dispose of it, get rid of it, just get a new one. In fact, you may even get a better deal on the new one than you had on the old one. And so rather than saying, which one of you, if you lost one of your sheep, would not go and find it, Jesus today might say, which one of you, if you lost one of your sheep, would not rejoice with your neighbors that you got a better deal on this sheep than you got on the last sheep? Because that's our economy. And in fact, in business, and I know we have some business owners here, but in business, an acceptable rate of loss is 1.5% of your material goods are going to be damaged or stolen or unaccounted for. 1.5%. And so this isn't even good business by modern standards, because there's still half a sheep that you could lose. I don't know how you would lose half a sheep, but you could lose half a sheep and still be in the acceptable margin of loss. for our way of living. So it's not to say that the parable is impenetrable, because the parable is not really about sheep, it's about God. But it is to say that our attitude about how we approach the world is different than theirs. And if we're honest, our attitude about how we approach the world is different than God's. Because God's acceptable percentage of loss isn't 1.5%. It's 0. That's the point of the parable. God's acceptable percentage of loss when it comes to his inventory is 0. It's interesting. One of the things you'll notice if you read the Bible, hopefully you do every once in a while, you just crack it open, just even if you just make it look like you're reading it, just crack it open and shake it out a little bit, is you'll notice how often in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially, God is counting people. And they say, and this tribe had 10,000, and this tribe had 7,000, and then 2,000 moved from here. And sometimes modern people, it's like, oh, why? Why are we reading the book of Numbers? It's literally a book called Numbers. It's a book filled with numbers. It's like, oh, what should we expect? The book was called Numbers. It's filled with numbers. What? I don't want to read a book about numbers. The reason is God loves counting his people like we love counting money. God loves counting his people like we love counting money. And that's why the second parable Jesus uses is a parable about money, because he goes, well, maybe you'll understand this. God's connection to the creation, God's connection to human beings, God's commitment to a 0% loss, meaning that God will somehow interact with every person, even if they're somehow lost, explains the ministry of Jesus and presents a problem to the religious community, which is us, if we're honest. Because the religious people in the text have an even higher percentage of loss than 1.5%. And the people in the text are concerned that if the lost sheep come back, they didn't just get lost innocently, like, well, I just turned around and you were all gone. The people who get lost in the gospel are people who, either by their circumstances in life or their moral choices, are somehow separated from the community. And the religious people are worried if we bring them in, they're going to mess up our space. And the two examples are tax collectors and prostitutes. And you'll notice that the Bible translators soft-pedaled the second term by saying tax collectors and sinners. The Greek says prostitutes. Because they go, well, we don't want to say the word prostitute in church. We just say sinner. Tax collectors and sinner. The tax collectors and prostitutes. The two groups of people who are being drawn to Jesus. Now, if you remember, the tax collectors, it was essentially like working for the mob. They were shaking people down. So it was more Tony Soprano than IRS. It's shaking people down. And they would pay up, we have to pay the boss. The Romans get what they want, and then we take our cut, and then you guys, if you don't give it to us, someone's going to come at night and break your business or break your legs or whatever they're going to do. It's the same dynamic. Human beings in their schemes of exploitation are not very creative. If it worked 2,000 years ago and it works today, just keep doing it. So you can understand why the religious people aren't so hot about having those sheep back in the fold. They're lost through their violence and their economic exploitation of other people in the community. Now, the second group of people, the prostitutes, whether by life circumstances or not, have also commodified the intimate relationship between people. Something that God intended to be a gift has now become a transaction and exchange. And when we met on Wednesday, we have this sister church in Japan, and the hotel they love to stay at in Costa Mesa is kind of a prostitute motel, because it's right by Target, it's right by Central Market. Some of the police in the congregation, some of the sheriff's department have been like, can you please ask them to stay somewhere else? This isn't a nice hotel. It's not a nice hotel. In fact, one of the Japanese pastors told me, he said, we thought all of California smelled like marijuana all the time because of where you guys put us. And they like it because it's easy walking distance. So when we met on Wednesday, we said, let's put them in a little nicer hotel, one that the sheriff's department recommends. That seems like a pretty low standard of recommendation. But it goes to show that the religious people are uncomfortable with prostitutes and tax collectors, people who are transacting with their bodies, people who are transacting with fear and violence, and Jesus isn't. And it says the religious people were all walking around murmuring. And the proper way to understand that murmuring isn't just a bunch of people going grumbling. It's like if you've ever been around a swarm of bees, And the one bee, you can't distinguish one bee. It's a buzzing. The air is vibrating with sound, and that sound is danger. Like you can feel it in your body, like, oh, I shouldn't be here. So when Jesus is there, the air is vibrating with the religious fear and anger of people saying, these sheep shouldn't come back. They shouldn't be here. And that becomes the tension into which Jesus speaks with his parable. He speaks God's commitment, and he speaks our propensity to get lost. And so something to think about for yourself is to ask yourself, my propensity to get lost as a sheep, and then also my living into God's unwillingness that there be any acceptable loss of people. Meaning that as Christians, we devote ourselves to the irreducible dignity of the human being. Because what happens when the 100 sheep become 1,000, 1,000,000, 10 million, 100 million, 7 billion? What happens when the problems that we face socially become overwhelming and we say, you know what? I know how to solve this problem. We just need to get rid of the sheep. We kind of default to an attitude of disposability of people like we do with the disposability of goods. And that must be resisted. And it must be resisted out of our deep inclination that God's acceptable margin of loss, which is 0, needs to be our commitment to love people for the sake of Jesus, the finder of the sheep. It doesn't mean we have to save the sheep, because we know there's a lot of people that we can't reach. Let's not be naive about what's possible, but it also means that we don't simply just eliminate the sheep from the fold. So that has to be part of our commitment. And the other part of our commitment has to be the recognition of how easy it is to get lost. How hard the walk of discipleship is to follow a crucified Lord, crucified and risen Lord, and how easy it is to exchange this way of life for another. And the reason that we have that reading from Exodus this morning that John read, the golden calf, is the great reminder to us. So when I was a young pastor, I had a couple come in and speak to me. They were friends, small business owners, decently successful, and the husband was trying to convince the wife to make a business decision she didn't want to make. And it wasn't morally problematic. It wasn't ethically problematic. She just didn't want to do it. And he goes, Pastor, I need you to talk to us so you can see if we can figure this out. And what he wanted from me is he wanted me to use the words of the church, don't be afraid, be faithful, God will take care of you, to convince his wife to do what he wanted. And I only realized that at the end of the conversation after I had just done that. And I went like, oh, this isn't what this is about. Now our faith is being misused to try and accommodate some other end besides God finding lost sheep, God offering redemption, God bringing people to wholeness. And it's that exchange that happened on the bottom of Mount Sinai when the people go, you know what? This sitting at the bottom of the mountain, this waiting for Moses, this idea about a law, this idea that we belong to God, this idea is not as fun as what if we got to just do whatever we want? And so they do. They take the earrings off their ears and they melt them down. And it's important that they get the adornment of hearing is now melted down to create this beast. And they worship it in a kind of orgy. Like the golden calf isn't them bowing. It's like a Hollywood Hills Playboy Mansion orgy. And it's really important you understand that because the passion, the passions, the desires, the greed, the lust, all of that gets folded into a religious ecstasy so that when Moses comes down, he's like, what happened? I was just here and now you guys are doing this. And God's love has to call them back. Now, sometimes people read that and they go, it didn't say God's love, it said God's wrath. Don't try and trick me, preacher. I listened to that. Don't trick me. God is only one thing, which is love, and God's love can be experienced subjectively as something loving or wrathful. And wrathful not in the sense of let the bodies hit the floor, but wrathful in the sense of a love that demands you to be who God made you to be. And what Moses does is when it says God changed his mind, what he means is God just remembered his own promises, and God's faithfulness saves the people. Because what does Moses say? Remember Abraham, remember Isaac, remember Jacob. And God goes, oh yeah, I promised that. And what's going to get us out of this situation is my faithfulness to myself. At the second service, we're going to have a baptism of a baby, and we're going to make that same proclamation. God is making a promise to you, and God will be faithful to you. And even if you're not faithful back, what matters is God's fidelity to himself. If God makes a promise, God keeps it. And that's what allows us to build a life of faith. Not our fidelity, because we too easily bow down to the calf and the fun. Not our fidelity, because we too easily dispose of things and measure things by the deals we get. Rather, the fidelity of God that says, I will not accept that anyone who bears my image shall be lost without me reaching out to them to find and hopefully to redeem. And whatever happens at the end, that's up to God. As one of my old friends said, an old Marine chaplain, Navy chaplain attached to the Marine Corps, whenever people would ask him hard theological questions, he would say, I'm sorry, I'm in sales, not service. You're going to have to find someone else to answer that question. So at a certain point, it's up to God in terms of what God does. But God will be faithful to himself. And by that faith, we can live, and we too can have arms open to sheep who may be lost or troubled. Amen.